So I've been sent many controllers for review, and everyone is getting into the leverless game. Mayflash has made leverless controllers before, but this time they're making a leverless version of their F700. That means it's got the bigger footprint with more features, more buttons, and just more compatibility with consoles like PS5 and Xbox. But at $200, even though it's packed full to the brim with features, is this the leverless controller that you should be looking at? Let's talk about it. Mayflash sent this controller to me for the purposes of making this video. I don't have to say anything specific about it. I don't have to send it back at the end, and all opinions are my own. So the reason I'm starting this video off with a question about the price is that this is a little bit more expensive than your usual Mayflash controller. Generally, they have controllers like this. The F500 FLAT, this controller was $89, and it was compatible with actually a large number of consoles like PS4 and Xbox Series X. And I've also reviewed a couple of these, the F700 series, which are regular arcade sticks. Again, they've got this larger footprint, but a ton of features, and of course, all that compatibility with multiple different consoles. But even this one, the F700, this went for $149, and that's considered kind of like top of the line at the moment when it comes to the arcade stick line. So a leverless controller, which has no joystick component, it's just more buttons. In a way, you might expect it to be a little bit cheaper, but this comes in at $199. So of course that leads to the question, why is it more expensive? And more importantly, even though it's a little more expensive, is it still the best value for money when it comes to arcade stick controllers? Because Mayflash really does pack the features in. Let's talk about what those features are. If you've seen the review that I made previously for this controller, the F500 FLAT, then you probably know about most of the features that you're going to see here. But there are some important differences. First of all, it's more than double the price, which I've mentioned already. But the new version, the F700 FLAT Elite, comes with Sanwa buttons as standard. Now, there's really nothing wrong with the buttons on the original Mayflash, but as you can see, they feel a little bit dumpy by comparison as opposed to like tappy. But really that comes down to like the sound. It doesn't actually feel that dumpy to play on, like they just feel like buttons. But if you are sensitive to that sort of thing and you can tell exactly how sensitive a Sanwa button is and exactly how it feels to bounce off with that slightly tappier sound, then you're going to be very happy that this has Sanwa buttons as standard. And I believe they are Sanwa buttons. Sorry, I just smashed the microphone. I believe they are Sanwa buttons for all of the buttons on here. I might actually just put the other controller side by side so that you can see both. Now, Sanwa buttons are more expensive and the standard that you'll find in Japanese game centers, but you probably should know that most of the leverless controllers coming out there are kind of customized. Either people are making their own button caps, they're using button caps by Punk Workshop, or they're using like key switches from keyboards, either low profile key switches or regular Cherry MX style key switches. So of course any kind of upgrade is welcome, but I'm not 100% sure how necessary it is. Maybe they put more expensive components in so that they could increase the price and make more of a profit on the product. Don't know. Honestly, I don't think that's the case, because really when you hear about all the other features packed in here, they have crammed a lot in. You can also see there are more buttons on the new version. There were 8 action buttons and 4 directions over here with 2 extra buttons. Over here, we've got the same layout, 4 directions, 8 action buttons, and instead of 1, 2 extra buttons, we've actually got 3 extra buttons. And this is not a touchpad. Usually it's set to R3 and L3 down here, but now we've also got a button called M1, and you can actually set this to anything you want. You just hold down the right button for the right amount of time, and then you press this and the button that you want to, copy, basically. You want to copy a button from here to here. One confusing thing about this M button is that even though it's called a macro button, you can't actually program a technical input to this macro. So I tried doing like a fireball, which is down, forward, punch, and then you actually get a fireball. But on here, you do that combination, it doesn't work. I think you can only set a single button combination, not a technical motion in action. You can also see the layout is slightly different. On the new version, we have this rounded layout over here, which is a little bit different to the previous one, which is more like a Vuelix style layout, and that will kind of change the angle of your hand. Normally you have your hand a little bit tilted like this for the Vuelix layout because the buttons kind of go out like this, but with this layout over here, you kind of have your hands kind of more like this. It feels comfortable. It doesn't feel uncomfortable. In fact, I really liked the layout on here. It feels very, very natural for my hands, whether you have your arm out like this or your arm kind of in like this. You can also see that one button has been removed from this version, where there was an options button right here in the middle at the top of the controller. On the F700, we don't have a large button for the options. It has been changed back to being a teeny tiny little options button along this menu down here. And that is 100% fine with me, because I always wondered, like, do we really press the options button that often that it needs to be big? I think I may have even suggested that this should have been a touchpad button instead of an options button. It's also got a headset port if you're using a gaming headset, and a physical button that you can use to mute your mic. Now, there were a number of features on the original version, like Turbo 1 and Turbo 2, which are a little bit different on the F500, but here on the F700, what you have is analog switch emulation. So it's not actually analog, but if you need to like move the camera around, you can make these direction buttons work like a left analog stick or a right analog stick, but I usually leave it in the middle for the D-pad. You can also switch between the connectivity options. You've got wireless, USB, or Bluetooth, and which is incredible. A synchronize button for the wireless. You've got your turbo button here, share, touchpad, home, options. Now, the reason that some of these modes are different is, one, obviously to just make it more like the standard F700 line, but also because you do have a completely separate dial over here. So this switch over here used to switch between X input or the PlayStation console modes, but this version here is actually compatible with PS4 or PS5 or Xbox Series X without any kind of controller bridge. Now, if you're not familiar with these controllers, a controller like this, to work on a PS4, you actually have to plug an actual PS4 controller into here. Otherwise, it will time out after 8 minutes. But if you want to use a controller like this on a PlayStation 4 or PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X, you really just turn this dial and then you just play. And there is no time limit. There isn't even a port on the top of the controller to plug an extra controller in, because you can't. That's just not how it works. So already, if you were looking to buy this to work with a PlayStation and you didn't have a PlayStation controller to authenticate it to make it work on a PlayStation, you're already saving like $50 or $60 from buying an official DualShock 4 just to plug it into here. And it's too much to think about. If you're not playing on PC, like, you have extra headaches on console with a controller like this. But what's great about this Elite version is that whether you're playing on PS5 or Xbox Series X or Apple devices or retro consoles, and we're not talking about actual retro consoles, we're talking about like the SNK Mini sort of retro-ish console, or Android. Who's playing fighting games on Android? That being said, if you're using it with emulators, which is something I don't really get into, maybe that's something worth trying. So $90 versus $200. Obviously, it's a big price gap, but this is significantly going to be easier to use than this one when it comes to working with a console. And you also have a little bit more peace of mind when you get to a tournament. If you are going to use this as your tournament controller, you don't have to worry about faffing around with the controller. It's just like extra headaches working with this weird sort of hack system when you could just use a controller which is already compatible. But that's where we need to talk about another thing, which is the fact that it is not officially compatible. It's just compatible. When you buy a controller from the big brands like Razer or Hori or Quanba, they have the word officially licensed on the product, which means that it should work. Like, according to PlayStation, your controller is going to work. They're not going to like release firmware updates that like break controllers, or they're not supposed to, at least. But with the Mayflash, there's no real guarantee that it's always going to work on your PS5 or Xbox Series X. It's the same thing with Brook adapters. Even though we buy these adapters, like, they're programmed with the current firmware on PlayStations and Xboxes. They're programmed to make our controllers work on them. But if there's an update in the future, we don't 100% know that they're always going to work. So if you want full peace of mind, you are probably better off buying an officially licensed controller. But having said that, now that Sony co-owns Evo, I find it very, very unlikely that they would break compatibility on controllers, because they would just lose the goodwill of the fighting game community. And I think companies have kind of seen, like, this is not a community that you want to like piss off. You want to like give them what they want, because they're fighters, you know, they've got the fighting spirit. So in that regard, personally, I would have no worries bringing a controller that's not officially licensed to a tournament. I'm like almost 100% sure that it's going to work at the tournament. So there's the fact that it's compatible with all of these different devices, but what's also really awesome is that the connectivity means that it's wireless or wired, and that all comes from this magical compartment right here. When you open it, first of all, cable storage inside the device. Like, this is something you only get from big devices like this. So as a result of not really being comfortable when you're using it on a desk, if you only expect to use it on your lap like so, then you've got a thicker controller, but it's still very comfortable, and you also have space for things like cable storage. Now in here you will find the wired cable. It's not a removable cable, it's like wired into the PCB, so try not to break it. I've never had an issue with like a cable breaking on one of these things for me. But you get your USB cable like this. It's moderately long. It's probably, I don't know, 2 meters, 1.8 meters-ish. And if you are predominantly using this controller at home, people are going to love you for keeping your controller tidy and not just having cables lying around everywhere, because you can just close it, and I thought that was going to be smoother. You can just close the cable away like so. But the other thing inside here is the dongle, and this thing is magical because you can plug straight into your PS5 or your Switch or your PC and run it in any of these modes that, whatever compatibility mode you need, so that you can get low latency gaming wirelessly. Again, I haven't done any like specific tests to see exactly how fast it is, but I did not notice any lag at all when using this wireless dongle. But moreover, it's just super convenient to be able to plug in without having to go into any Bluetooth settings and like find the synchronizations, or when you leave the setup, maybe you're at a local event or maybe you're at a tournament, like if you forget to desync your controller, you could end up like causing like an issue in someone else's match later. If you are using a dongle, at least you have the peace of mind. It's like, when I pull this thing out, I'm disconnected from that system and I have nothing to do with it ever again. So you just leave this dongle in here. But of course, if you don't want to use the dongle, you can also use this controller in Bluetooth mode. So you'll have all the benefits of a wireless controller, but you'll have to go through all of those syncing things. So those are the main features of the Mayflash F700 FLAT Elite. And compared to the F500, it does feel like a significant upgrade. But for this price, you could buy 2 of this controller. So now the question is it really worth it? Now, when it came to the F500, it was basically a very good value proposition. First of all, if you're only playing on PC, you're not actually playing on console, then this is all you need. It gets you into the leverless game. It's got buttons that feel great to me. They're not soundwares, but they do feel like good buttons that I would totally be fine playing with these buttons. You really are just missing out on the compatibility. You still have extra buttons down here like L2 and L3 either side of the jump button. But if you wanted this controller to be compatible with your PS5, you would need to buy a dongle. Now, Mayflash make their own adapters as well, or you can use converters from Brook. And if you add that to the cost of this controller, now you're up to $140. Whereas over here, without any extra costs, you're already compatible with PS5, but also Xbox Series X. What you really get in terms of functionality on here is a whole extra button, if you find that useful, on your left hand. I try not to focus on too much action stuff on my left hand, so I don't even use this button, but you get this extra button, and more importantly, you get Bluetooth functionality and this wireless dongle. So 2 different forms of wireless functionality, one of them being super convenient in the form of a dongle, plus this also obviously has a battery inside. In order for it to work as a wireless controller, it'd be a bit pointless if it didn't have a battery to actually make it function. So a whole extra button, 2 different forms of wireless connectivity, an internal battery, and don't forget all of these other random modes on this convenient dial over here, like being able to connect to your Android phone. One thing I will also point out, which is kind of interesting in this comparison, I'm not trying to like say that it is good value or it isn't good value or anything, but this is the Mayflash F700 arcade stick version, right? So it's not the flat version. This is also an Elite controller, but $50 cheaper, right? The Flat Elite is $50 more expensive, but this is actually the PlayStation version of the F700. If you want the Xbox version, you have to get the F700 X. So instead of making one Elite controller that was $200, they made an X version and a PlayStation version, and they're $150. So I guess the thinking with the F700 Flat Elite is that instead of making people buy 2 separate controllers, why don't they just add $50 to the price and then just make it do both? And hey presto, we have the Xbox button here and the PS5 button here. But wait, aren't there leverless controllers out there for like $50? I hear you, and absolutely, yes, there are controllers out there for $50. So if you don't need console compatibility, you don't need this controller. You can buy a controller for $50 and you'll work on your PC without any time limits and you'll be absolutely fine. However, Would you get wireless? Would you get the ability to work on console? If you go to a tournament, are you going to have to faff around with authentication devices? If you plan to go to tournaments or local events, that's where it starts to get complicated because people usually can't afford to have desktop setups at locals or tournaments, and especially things like Evo, it's like sponsored by Sony. Everything is running on Sony PlayStation 5, so having PS5 compatibility, it's kind of in your best interest if you plan to ever leave the house. But it's definitely worth pointing out that controllers that cost like $50, they still have RGB flashing lights on them and they do look really cool. For $200, you get this F700 FLAT with lots of buttons, extra buttons over here, all of that console compatibility, wireless features, and also just the benefits of using a larger controller, like having a really nice big surface here to draw stick art or to commission someone to draw something really nice. Plenty of space both here on the left and the right, and it's obviously very simple to do so because this is a removable acrylic panel. I have to admit that since I haven't recently been playing on Sanwa buttons, getting back into playing on Sanwas took me a moment, but actually it feels quite nice. I forgot that Sanwas are a quite nice button. But more importantly, I wanted to leave you with this story that when I was testing this controller for this review, I was just playing on my PlayStation and I actually got someone to rage quit. I was just like, yes! It's like the most satisfying thing. Like, it's better than winning in a fighting game. If you can get your opponent to rage quit, it's like this is why it's like great that rage quitting is still possible, right? Because like if you can get to the point where your opponent like rage quits out of your super combo at the end because they know that they're done, I don't know, that's really satisfying. I just wanted to mention that doesn't really happen to me very often. But when I was playing on this, I got someone to rage quit, so that made me feel pretty good. And the oh so important non-slip padding all over the bottom. I feel like I win every time a company puts non-slip padding on the bottom, all over the bottom. Listen, that's pretty much everything I have to say about the F700 FLAT Elite controller. It does put itself in a slightly different price tier than Mayflash controllers tend to be. And so in that regard, I'm a little bit conflicted. If I'm paying $200, shouldn't I be looking at maybe an officially licensed controller or controller that's a little bit flatter and easier to be, taken around, a little more mobile and portable? That's something you'll have to decide on your own. But if you're only thinking about, is it actually worth the money? Like, if you don't mind the size of this controller, if you're actually like, how do I get the most features packed into a controller for the money and still have that customizability, able to change the artwork and change all the buttons and slide in different stuff because it's huge, there's plenty of space for modability. If you're thinking in that regard, you really can't beat Mayflash. They just cram these controllers full of features. So in that regard, I actually think $200 is a very reasonable price. But the question is, at $200, could you be looking at something a little fancier with more flashing lights and just better mobility and portability? Those are the things that I'd like you to consider. That's your homework for today. That's not your homework. Those are the things that you should probably consider if you're deciding whether this is the right controller for you. But if the price is right, you can't really go wrong because it's a nice feeling controller. And now with Sanwa buttons. I've been NihongoGamer. Hope you've enjoyed this review. I'll see you real soon.